Let's turn in our Bibles to Acts chapter 25. Chapter 25 really begins in chapter 24, verse 27. It really ties together with chapter 25. Paul has been in Caesarea for 2 years under house arrest. Felix, who was the Roman governor, has been playing politics. And the Jewish people were not happy with Felix. As we have pointed out, he was a slave at one time, but his brother was a close companion to Caesar Nero. And he had his brother Felix elevated to the governor over the Judean province. A slave becoming a governor, he became the kind of a tyrant ruler that you would expect. The Jews were very displeased, and he was trying to curry their favor because they were writing to Rome about the mismanagement of his government. They finally sent emissaries to Rome to have him removed. And so he was seeking to curry their favor, and knowing that they were wanting to prosecute Paul, rather than releasing Paul because there were no legitimate charges against him that would entail the Roman government, he held Paul under house arrest for 2 years there in Caesarea. And he was really hoping that Paul would give him a bribe in order to release him. But Paul would not stoop to such a method of gaining release. And so he remained for 2 years a prisoner, however, with much freedom. Philip the evangelist and other of the Christians in Caesarea were free to come and visit Paul. You always wonder if Cornelius, who was a Roman centurion there in Cornelius, who through Peter received the Holy Spirit when the Spirit of God was first poured out upon the Gentiles, if he was maybe still there in Caesarea and had good fellowship with Paul. We don't know, but it's always interesting to sort of romanticize and think that that might have been so, that Paul and Cornelius had many good talks together. But after the 2 years, we read that Porcius Festus came into Felix's place. And Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So Felix is now, though he sought to gain pleasure, because of the Jews, was deposed and would have been punished had it not been for Pallas, his brother, who interceded for him with Caesar Nero. So he was just banished, really, from that area. Festus was a basically good man. He only reigned for 2 years before he died. But coming now as the Roman governor of this province, he first went up to Jerusalem. The Roman headquarters were there in Caesarea. But as is in the political circles, when a new person, an ambassador or governor or whatever, comes upon the scene, his first task is to go and meet with the leaders of the nation, to more or less present your credentials and to just have a time of meeting them and dinners and so forth, and becoming acquainted with the people and trying to create sort of a rapport with them so that you can have sort of a common understanding of each other. So he went on up to Jerusalem, more or less to present himself to the Jewish leaders and to meet with them and to talk with them over their affairs. The interesting thing to me is that verse 2, then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul. And they besought him and desired favor against Paul, that he would send for him to Jerusalem. And of course, their motive was to lay in wait and to ambush and to kill Paul. This is interesting to me. Their resentment and hatred of Paul was so deep that after 2 years you would think that they would have forgotten all about it, that it would have been just something of the past. But they are harboring these feelings still after 2 years and wanting Paul to be brought to Jerusalem for the purpose of their being able to get him away from the protection of the Roman government and assassinate him. Now, you need to remember these are the religious leaders that are desiring to commit this crime, really, against Paul, and so angry, so filled with bitterness, they still, after 2 years, are holding this in their hearts. Bitterness is a strange and a horrible thing. The Bible has warnings to us concerning bitterness. But one of the things concerning bitterness is that the one who really gets hurt the most through bitterness is the person who is bitter. The Bible talks about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And it's interesting how that our emotions affect the glands within our body, so that the glands respond to emotions. And the glands are producing certain chemicals into our body that are associated with an emotion that we might be experiencing. For instance, the emotion of fear. The adrenal glands begin to pour adrenaline into your system. This shot of adrenaline that comes into your system when you're afraid gives you an extra shot of energy. You can run faster than you normally could when you've got that jolt of adrenaline in your system. You're stronger than you normally are when you get that jolt of adrenaline. And so fear creates that adrenaline, and it has its advantage. Of course, it has to be worked out or it can be harmful to you. Bitterness creates chemicals in your body, and they do associate oftentimes the ulcers that a person gets with bitterness that puts these acids and chemicals into your body that begin to eat away at your body. Laughter, the Bible says it does a heart good like a medicine. Good chemicals coming into your body, helping you actually to digest your food, interestingly enough. So that's why it's good to laugh at dinner time. And so it just is helpful. And this relationship, now if you are holding bitterness in your heart, it's having a detrimental effect upon you physically because of the chemicals that are produced from bitter attitudes. And so you ultimately are the one who receives the most hurt and damage from being bitter. Here are these men, after 2 years, still having this bitterness toward Paul, still desiring to kill him. Why? Because he believes that Jesus is the Messiah. And they know he is a brilliant man. They know that he could be very influential in persuading other Jews because he had been one of the chief of the Pharisees. And he could persuade others, and thus he was a real threat to them, even as they plotted the death of Jesus, because Jesus was a threat to them and to their position. They were afraid that if people would turn after Jesus, that they would lose their control and power over the people, and that's why they determined to have him crucified. Now Paul becomes a threat because he has come to believe in Jesus, and they know that if Paul is persuading many of the Jews to accept the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, that their positions of control over the people would be lost. So they are requesting now, Festus, that he would bring Paul to Jerusalem to stand trial before their court. Of course, as I said, their plan and plot was to assassinate Paul when they got him away from the Roman powers. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea and that he himself would soon depart for Caesarea. Now, it is quite possible and very probable that Felix had told Festus about Paul. In the changing of the hands of government, Felix would have shared with Festus as much as he could about the situation of how things were going and the unfinished business, and Paul definitely was a part of the unfinished business. And he probably told Festus about the Jews endeavoring to kill him. And thus, having been informed by Felix that the Jews were intent on killing Paul, Festus very wisely just declared, no, he should remain in Caesarea. And I'm going there very soon. You read 10 days, but many of the translators say 8 to 10 days. Let them therefore, which are among you, who are able, let them go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. In other words, I will go ahead and try him. Come on down, bring your accusations, but we will meet in the court there in Caesarea. And so when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, or 8 to 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. So, not wasting any time, as soon as he gets back to Caesarea, the next day, the court session is called, and Paul is brought in. And when he was come in, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about, and they laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which, and here's the bottom line, they could not prove. There are oftentimes many accusations made against people. And oftentimes there is no basis for the accusations. Just recently, I received a letter with several accusations. But as I read the letter, I felt like Paul, show proof There are just allegations, there are intimations, there are suggestions of perhaps improprieties, but absolutely nothing to prove the charges. And so with Paul, they were making many accusations concerning Paul, but they weren't offering any proof. Why? Because there was no proof. And of course, in a court of law, your desire is to find the truth. And the truth is established by eyewitnesses. You can't testify in the court and say, well, I really think that the fellow is guilty myself. Or someone told me that he said. No, that cannot be entered as evidence because it's only hearsay. You've heard someone say that, but you didn't hear that yourself. And so that's hearsay, inadmissible evidence in court. And so they weren't able to offer in the court any actual evidence against Paul. Only the allegations were made. And so Paul again was given the opportunity to answer for himself. And actually, this is pretty much a repeat of the trial that Paul had before Felix, where they made all of these accusations. And then Paul just stood up and said, well, they can't prove any of the allegations that they have made. And so when Paul answered for himself, he said, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. I'm totally innocent of the charges that they are trying to lay upon me. I haven't really come against the Jewish religion. I haven't come against the temple. You remember he was accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple grounds. And he was also accused of creating seditions against the Roman government. But Paul said, I'm innocent of all of these charges. They cannot give any proof. There's no real witnesses that can actually declare what they're saying is true. So, Festus, typical politician, willing to do the Jews a pleasure. He's just come into the office. He would like to sort of ingratiate himself with the Jews, using Paul as a pawn in this game, and hoping to sort of gain the favor of the Jews. He said to Paul, will you go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? Now, Festus, knowing that Paul would never get a fair hearing before their court, but Festus is saying, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and let these charges be made in Jerusalem? Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, and they know that very well. Paul is now using his right as a Roman citizen to make an appeal directly to Caesar. This was the privilege of Roman citizens. If you felt that you were getting a bad deal, that there was a lack of real justice being done, as long as your crime was not one of murder, you could make your appeal to Caesar, and Caesar would hear your case. So Paul, realizing that Festus is just going to try to use him as a political pawn, realizing that the motive of Festus wasn't really to see real justice done to Paul, but just to gain and curry the favor of the Jews, said that he was going to appeal his case to Caesar. He said, "For if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die." I'm not going to try to run if I'm really guilty of charges that are worthy of death. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them, because I appeal unto Caesar. So Paul, knowing that there was still their plot and desire to kill him, is not going to just recklessly put his life in jeopardy, but he is going to exercise his right as a Roman citizen and makes his appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, he answered, "Have you appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar you shall go." So Paul's appeal has been accepted, and of course Festus is getting rid of the problem. He's not going to have to make a judgment on it, and so they confer and decide to accept Paul's appeal, and thus he will be sent to Caesar. Now, Paul, when he wrote the book of Romans, writing to the church in Rome, he had never been to Rome. Yet he wrote the book to the church in Rome. And as he wrote his letter to the church in Rome, he spoke of his desire to come and meet them face to face, that there might be a mutual benefit, that he might impart to them spiritual gifts, and he might be benefited by the fellowship and the experiences they had with the Lord. That is in chapter 1. In chapter 15, as he is closing his letter to the Romans, again he spoke of his desire to come and to minister there in Rome, perhaps on his way to Spain. And so he has been assured by the Lord, when he was in prison there in Jerusalem, that he would be in Rome to bear witness of Jesus there in Rome. So Paul knew, because Jesus told him, that he's going to go to Rome, but he didn't know by what means he would be going to Rome. A lot of times I think that the Lord sort of gives us an inkling of what his plan is for our lives, but he doesn't give us details. And because we don't have the details, oftentimes in our mind, we begin to work out the means by which the will of God might be performed. And we, if this would happen and that, well, I can, do this. And we sort of in our minds develop a sort of a plan of action. And then oftentimes, when our plans of action just seem to fall apart, we oftentimes fall apart with the plans. We think, well, did God really speak to me? And is it really going to happen? And we get discouraged many times because what we thought was going to be the way God was going to do it, God didn't do it. But God oftentimes has different ways than what we have thought or conceived in our own minds. God said, "My ways are not your ways. My ways are beyond your finding out." And so here's God working out the way by which Paul is going to get to Rome. It's by his realizing that he is getting a bum deal from Festus, and thus using his appeal to Caesar as the means by which he will ultimately come to Rome. And so Paul is made then that appeal and is going to be sent courtesy of the Roman government to Rome. And so when they had been there for many days, verse 14, Festus declared Paul's cause to the king. Well, let's go back to 13. 12, that's where we left off. Festus, when he had conferred with the council, said to Caesar, you'll go. And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to greet Festus. Festus was the new governor. King Agrippa was a Roman appointee over a small section of the country. This is a courtesy visit. We have a new governor from Rome over the whole territory. So Agrippa comes to meet with Festus, with Bernice. Now, his father was King Agrippa the First. He was the one who we read about earlier, who made a great oration to the men of Tyre and Sidon, who began to cry out, it's the voice of a God and not of a man. And he didn't give glory to God, so the angels smote him, and he died. He had 2 daughters, both of them very beautiful. The one was married to Felix, Drusilla. Bernice, another of his daughters, actually was proposed to by a king, and she, being a Jewess, said if he would be circumcised, she would marry him. He was. They were married, but it didn't last. King Agrippa here in our text is the son of Agrippa the First. He's King Agrippa the Second. Bernice is actually his sister, and they began to live together. And it was sort of a national kind of scandal. Josephus writes about the scandalous behavior and the incestuous relationship that the brother and sister were having, Agrippa and Bernice. Being Jews, they knew the Jewish law. In fact, Agrippa had studied the Jewish law. And so they are not, though, the most noble or moral of people. But they come and visit Festus. And when he had been there for many days, Festus told him about Paul's case. And he said, there was a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. And to whom I answered, it's not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers, or has the opportunity to meet the accusers face to face, and have the license to answer for himself concerning the crime that's laid against him. Now, when they told Festus about Paul, no doubt they were wanting to have the death sentence administered to Paul. But Festus said, Roman law doesn't allow a man to be put to death without specific charges, and he has the right to meet those people that are making the charges and the freedom to answer the charges himself. Therefore, when they were come down, without any delay, on the next day I set up the judgment seat, and I commanded the man to be brought forth, against whom, when the accusers stood up, they didn't bring any of the accusations of such things as I supposed. I don't know what he thought they were going to charge Paul with, but he was sort of surprised when he saw how lame their case was against Paul. And he knew that there was no way that he could sentence Paul to death under the unprovable charges that had been made against Paul. So he said all they had was certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed was alive. You see, this is the heart of the issue. Paul's belief in the resurrection of Jesus and their denial of the resurrection of Jesus. The high priest at that time and the majority of the Sanhedrin were of the Sadducean sect. And the Sadducean sect did not believe in the resurrection. And when Paul was teaching that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, that he had met the Lord, and that through that meeting with the Lord, his life was changed, it really throws their whole dogma into a tailspin. And so these are the things that they were charging Paul against. And Festus, of course, didn't know anything about the Jewish laws or the Jewish faith or Jesus. And so he was just sort of left in a confused state. And that's why he said, "Are you willing to go to Jerusalem to face these charges?" And Paul made his appeal to Caesar. And because he said, "I doubted of such manner of questions," I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, and that was a title for the Caesar, Augustus. They were titles for the emperor. The emperor at that time was Nero. I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, "I would also hear the man myself." "Tomorrow," he said, "you will hear him." So here Agrippa agrees to hear Paul, to let Paul give his testimony to Agrippa of his faith. Now, Agrippa had heard about Jesus. No doubt was curious concerning Jesus. And now the opportunity to hear Paul's witness of Jesus Christ, his desire to hear it himself. I will listen to it. And so he said, "Good, tomorrow." And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with great pomp, and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains, the principal men of the city, at Festus' command, Paul was brought forth. So here you can sort of picture this scene of all of these notables. Here is King Agrippa and his sister Bernice. He in his kingly garb and she in her queenly garb. Here is Festus with his red robe of Roman government authority. Here are the Roman soldiers standing guard, the dignitaries of the city of Caesarea, all of them gathered to hear Paul make his defense. I'm sure that Paul was just sort of licking his chops, excited over the opportunity to share the truth of Jesus Christ with all of these notable people. About 11 years ago, I received a call from the King of Tonga, who was celebrating his 75th birthday. And they had planned a big birthday bash for the King of Tonga. And he asked me if I would come over and speak at the main banquet for the king. The King of Tonga is a Christian, beautiful man. So I flew over to Tonga, and because he is the King of Tonga, there were many ambassadors that had come to Tonga for the celebration of his 75th birthday. And we were in the banquet hall, and there were ambassadors from all over the world. And I had an opportunity while there to meet the ambassador for Russia and had a great talk with him. And the king said to me, "Give them the gospel." This is probably the only opportunity many of them will ever have to hear the gospel. Give them the gospel straight. I want that as my 75th birthday present. So I gave the gospel straight. I talked about agnosticism. The reasons why people often reject Christ, and many say, well, I'm an agnostic. And I gave my little pitch on agnosticism, how that it's a Greek word that means not to know. And the Latin equivalent of agnostic is ignoramus. And I said, there may be some of you today that if we ask you about God, you will say, I'm an agnostic. And it sounds very intellectual to say I'm an agnostic. And I said, but in reality, do you realize you're actually saying, I'm an ignoramus? And I said, that doesn't sound very intelligent, does it? Well, the next day, I was waiting to see the king, and in the waiting room, I sat down next to the wife of the ambassador from Australia. We started to make a little conversation, and she was as cold as ice. And she said, well, I'm an ignoramus. Well, she got the message. But here's Paul, having now the opportunity to share Jesus Christ with all of these people, the king, the Roman government, the officials of Rome and the officials of the city. They're all there. And Paul's opportunity now to share the gospel with them. So Paul is brought forth. So as Paul is brought forth, Festus opens the whole hearing by declaring, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, you see this man, about whom all of the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. They're all calling for his death. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself has appealed to Augustus, I've determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination is made, I might have somewhat to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes that are laid against him. Festus was in a bind. There was a miscarriage of justice. There were false charges made against Paul, or unprovable charges, none of them deserving of death. It was concerning Paul's belief in Jesus and the resurrection from the dead. And Festus should have, at that time, dismissed the case. But he was playing politics and he got caught. He said to Paul, are you willing to go to Jerusalem and face the charges there? And Paul said, I appeal to Caesar. Festus is caught. Because Paul is a Roman citizen, he has that right to be sent to Caesar. But when Paul comes to Rome, the governor or the judge should always send the brief of the charges that were made and of the case that was held in court. Had the brief been sent to Nero, Festus would be in big trouble, because it would be very obvious that he had not exercised true Roman justice, that he was holding a Roman prisoner longer than could be held without specific charges. So he is really now seeking the help of Agrippa. Listen to the man's story, and then help me write the brief to Nero so that we can specify charges and so forth. And so he's seeking to get help out of the pickle that he is in because of his playing politics. Be careful about playing politics. It can get you into a heap of problems. And so with Festus, he's facing some real problems. So in our next lesson, we'll have Paul's defense before Agrippa, which is probably one of the most powerful presentations of the gospel of Christ ever given. Why? Because Paul is going to seek to convert the whole crowd, if he possibly can, to Jesus Christ. He's going to let out all the stops and really lay it heavy on them. And so we'll find Paul's defense in our next lesson.